Scheduling in this sport is so broken. It's so broken, and it's their fault. It's the fault of anyone who advocated for expanding these conferences and realigning these conferences. College football was never meant for a conference to be coast to coast. College football was never meant to have conferences 16 or 18 teams deep, but yet here we are. And so scheduling is stupid right now. Even league scheduling is stupid right now. So do we at least agree on that? Like, do we all at least agree that it's pretty dumb to have 18 teams or 16 teams in a conference and have the vast disparity in strength of schedule, Team A to Team B? I mean, last year I looked at Florida and then I looked at Missouri. These schedules were from different planets, and yet allegedly they played in the same conference. So here's what I would love to do, and we've been working on this internally. I am really passionate, maybe the right word. I'm really aggressive about properly defining strength of schedule for our own purposes, purpi, the plural of purpose, in-house. I just want to know that for my own self. However, I also wish college football was a lot more dutiful about properly defining strength of schedule. So again, there's a problem, but what are we about around here? We want solutions. So in-house around here lately, we've been working on blending the proper criteria to properly define strength of schedule. And by that, I just mean I want to be able to pull up your 1 through 12, who are you playing this year, and I want to really know how tough your schedule is. And by tough, I don't mean let's just add up the combined record of your opponents at the end of the year, because if you are what your record says you are, then your schedule is a culmination of what your opponent's records say they are. That's just kindergarten 1984. We've come a long way since then. I think we got a little better understanding of the sport as it blends with data and mathematics and logic than we did back then. So what we do in-house every year, this year no exception, is I do like to go over in this time of year, because we haven't even gone through spring yet, I like to look at an odds board. Okay? I like to know, hey, what are the biggest sports books in the country saying about a team's odds to win the title this upcoming year? I go look at your roster talent, and I weigh that. I look at the quality of your coaching staff and your organization, and I weigh that. And we throw all of these things in a blender. Take all that criteria, just toss it in a blender, weight it properly, mix it properly. There's no one thing that's disproportionately weighted there. Although, I would argue roster grade is pretty heavily weighted. But what we do is we do all that, and then we spit it out. And I filter the teams into 8 different tiers, so that when I look at your schedule, I don't see that you're playing Akron, and then you're playing Charlotte, and then you're playing Clemson, and then you're playing Ohio State. I see that you're playing a tier 8, and then a tier 6, and then a tier 2, and then a tier 1. And that's how I like to define your schedule. And that's a living, breathing rating that changes throughout the year, and so on and so forth. So before we move on, I want to ask everyone, does that make sense to you? I just laid out the basic logic. You may have minor tweaks that you would make. You may have things that you care about a little bit more than I do. But broad strokes purposes, does that make sense? Does that inform you, in other words, about how difficult someone's schedule may be more than just looking at the record of the teams on the schedule? If you answer no, then the rest of this segment is not for you. I would venture to think most of you understand to some degree this is college football. There's a little bit more to how good a team is than what their record indicates. And I'm not so much talking about grading the team. Like if I'm Pate State over here and I'm 9-3, well, let's say I'm 9-2, and you're playing me this weekend, I'm not so much talking about whether 9-2 should be the way I judge Pate State when it comes to a playoff or anything like that. I mean, for your purposes, let me cut in really quick and ask, look, prayer hands, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you think you're subscribed, check and make sure. Over 50% of you aren't. It's free, it doesn't sign you up for anything, and it helps us keep the show free, college football year-round, the way God intended it. All right, back to the clip. You need to know, hey, are my 2 losses to the number 1 and number 2 team in the country? Or did I lose 2 games to average teams and then get fat on 9 wins against teams outside the top 100? Like, that matters very much so when it comes to defining your strength of schedule. So that's all we're trying to do here. So I'm looking in the live chat. A lot of people say, yes, this makes sense. The reason I wanted you to answer that, or if you're listening to the replay, listening to the podcast later, the reason I want you to answer that before I tell you what I'm about to tell you is because I want to know if the logic seems sound to you. Because this is the way you should approach this sort of thing. Does that reason, does that logic seem sound? Because there's no emotion involved in it. There's no favoritism. There's no bias. There's no anything like that, right? Do we agree with that? I think most of us agree with that. All right, so with that in mind, I need to inform you the SEC has 11 of the 12 toughest schedules this upcoming year. I'm just pausing for a second because we have thousands upon thousands of examples, at least, of people who are listening to the show or watching the show who just agreed that the logic makes sense, that are now calling it SEC homerism, and I didn't even change anything. In fact, I kind of had you agree on it before I presented the number. The number's the number. Number could change. The number will change because we haven't gone through spring. We haven't done our own inputs. So this is a very, very preliminary stat that I'm holding in my hand. But just a very, very broad February sort of look at this. And this is another reason scheduling is so broken in this sport right now. The SEC teams, we got 16 of them. SEC teams face 54 combined Tier 1 opponents this year. A lot of that's in conference play. The Big Ten faces 40. Okay, so SEC, 54 Tier 1 opponents. Big Ten, a little behind, but still way up there, 40 Tier 1 opponents. The ACC has a combined 18 Tier 1 opponents. The Big 12 has 1. And I think that was an out-of-conference game against like Oregon or something like that. 12 of the 16 teams in the SEC are either in Tier 1 or Tier 2. That is not to say that we would use this system to project that 12 SEC teams finish in like the top 15. Of course, that's impossible. We're talking about the difficulty you have in playing that team on any given Saturday when we're trying to define your strength of schedule. So the pushback on this, before anyone even bothers typing it, is a system like this is built to be self-fulfilling for the myth that is SEC and or Big Ten supremacy. And the thinking there is, well, of course, if you game the criteria on the front end, you can make the SEC or the Big Ten or any conference look as good as you want to on the back end. Which is, again, why I asked, does the logic make sense? Because, see, when we run our data sets, when we run our modeling, the computer doesn't even know what an SEC team is or a Big Ten team is. So the insinuation there for anyone who thinks that there's foul play involved here would be, well, yeah, the computer doesn't know what an SEC team is, but you know, because you programmed the thing, you know that the SEC teams are going to disproportionately recruit at a higher level. So if you tell the computer to disproportionately weight roster talent at a higher level, then lo and behold, it's going to say the SEC plays by and large a tougher conference schedule. Yes, it is. Where's the flaw in that logic? Can you think of something that makes an opponent tough that doesn't have to do with the talent on the field? Am I missing something there? So yes, this may say something you do or don't like. I got plenty about the sport I don't like. Hey, I wish the SEC didn't have 16 teams in the conference. I wish Texas and Oklahoma were still in the Big 12. I got a lot of things I wish, but it's not reality. I wish Oregon wasn't in the Big 10. I wish they were in the Pac-10, and I wish it was called 10 instead of 12. I got a lot of things I wish. I'm just calling balls and strikes here as it relates to strength of schedule. So the thing I took away from this is it's actually a really good time to be an elite team in the Big 10. Because the Big 10 at the top's really good. I would argue last year it was better than the SEC. I think that's pretty obvious. I don't think many people disagree with that. But think about the difference in the Tier 2, Tier 3 depth. In the Big 10, you got Ohio State and any given year Michigan, Oregon, Penn State's going to be there. What is Tier 2? It's really nothing. You just kind of skip down to what the equivalent of Tier 3 would be. In the SEC, we may not have even had the equivalent of a Tier 1, although we did. But there is so much Tier 2. 12 of the 16 teams in the SEC, by this logic, are either Tier 1 or Tier 2 teams. The Big 10, by comparison, has 4 Tier 1 teams, but only 1 in Tier 2. So there's a cliff. and then it drops off. So if you're Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon, whatever, in the Big Ten, and you qualify as elite for that given year, you want to play as many conference games as you can because statistically, you're more than likely playing a bunch of Tier 3 or below teams, and you're getting fat, and you get to flex on people because you talk about how many conference games you're playing. And Notre Dame also is in a really good position here because Notre Dame gets to decide their schedule. I got no problem with Notre Dame. I'm normally the one defending them when people hate on their schedule, but Notre Dame doesn't play a lot of games against any tier of the SEC. So they're playing a national schedule. They'll play a top ACC team in Miami. They'll play a good one from the SEC, a good Tier 2 team in Texas A&M this year. They'll play a Tier 3 or Tier 4 in the SEC on the road at Arkansas. But look at the totality of that schedule. It's a really manageable schedule. We'd have it in the 50s this year, I think, as of right now. So we aren't talking about the same sport, is what I'm getting at. The whole purpose behind this, the whole reason you have to talk about college football like this in a way you would never talk about pro sports is because in the NFL, the first hardest schedule and the 32nd hardest schedule are relatively close together compared to college football, where you got Oklahoma this year. I want you to listen to this. Oklahoma this year will play 6 games against Tier 1 teams. They'll play 3 games against Tier 2 teams. Brigham Young will play 0 games against Tier 1 or Tier 2 teams. And I'm supposed to believe you are what your record says you are, and they're playing the same sport. In reality, I mean, Brigham Young's got 10 games versus teams Tier 4 or worse. In reality, I think most people would look at that, and if Oklahoma went 9-3, you would consider them better than a 10-2 Brigham Young. The committee would consider them better than a 10-2 Brigham Young. In a logic-based world where this is properly weighted, you would have a world where an 11-1 Brigham Young is not superior to an 8-4 Oklahoma, depending on how that played out. The disparity in these schedules is night and day. Night and day. That is 9 games Oklahoma plays that is tougher than Brigham Young's toughest game this year. We're not even talking about the same sport. So there exists a need to define strength of schedule much differently than you are what your record says you are. We'll work on it when I'm elected, if I'm elected. I think I probably alienated a lot of people there. Again, I want to remind you, I don't like the way it is right now. I don't like that 2 schedules have completely, or 2 conferences have completely swallowed up the sport. Don't like it. Advocated against it. Fought against it. Don't like a lot of this. But once we're there, I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist. I don't say Power 4 very often on the show. The reason is because it insinuates there are 4 equal conferences out there. There aren't. There aren't at all. There's a Grand Canyon between the top 2 and whoever number 3 is. The cutoff is not after number 4. The cutoff is after number 2, whether I like it or not, because I don't. But to ignore that is to just ignore reality, and it's almost like you're trying to traffic in this idealistic, like fairy tale college football world. It doesn't exist. This college football is like Shawshank right now. It's a very ugly, mean place. But what are we going to do? We got to come in and clean it up. That's what we got to do.